Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the last of our events in our climate change series. And we're delighted to have alumni from 6 decades register this and also from several different countries. So a shout out to people watching in Canada, Hong Kong, Denmark, Switzerland, and the UK. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of you that have donated alongside your bookings for online events. These donations make a huge difference to our students, so we're incredibly grateful for your support. So thank you. So this evening, I am delighted to welcome one of our fellows, Professor Adam Branch, who is Professor of International Politics and the Director of Centre for African Studies at Cambridge, and he's also the Philomathia Fellow at Trinity Hall. And his research examines the politics of global justice, and in particular, sustainable energy and climate change adaptation. And he'll be talking to us about climate change and non-fossil fuels in East Africa. So I'll hand over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Shell, very much for that kind introduction and also for the opportunity to speak as part of this series at Trinity Hall, talk about some of my current research and sort of the ways it ties into some of the questions of the entire series. So questions around climate change. Where I'd like to start is last week at the COP26, where one of the first really big announcements that we heard was that states had signed on to a landmark agreement, a declaration to end deforestation over the next decade. Now, the language of the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use resounded with, as we might expect, evocative imagery and pledges. It said, quote, "We, the leaders of the countries identified below, emphasize the critical and interdependent roles of forests of all types, biodiversity and sustainable land use in enabling the world to meet its sustainable development goals, to help achieve a balance between anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and removal by sinks, to adapt to climate change and to maintain other ecosystem services. We therefore commit to working collectively to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030, while delivering sustainable development and promoting an inclusive rural transformation." It was a declaration by states that collectively covered about 90% of the world's forests and involved a pledge of almost 14 billion in public and private funds. African countries featured very strongly in this, and dozens signed on. So the debate that was heard afterwards was the usual one. Is this just another empty declaration, or will it lead to real action? Will the signatories actually follow through? But my view is that for communities in some parts of the world, this may not, in fact, be the most important question. I think we tend to have a certain image in mind when we hear about ending deforestation globally. It's probably the one that the BBC article that accompanied it's the image that accompanied the BBC article about the declaration, which was cattle grazing in cleared parts of the Amazon, or else the picture of forests being clear cut for soybean or palm oil plantations. So we have this image when we hear about deforestation. The image we often have is the destruction of huge swaths of the planet's remaining rainforest in order to provide raw materials for unsustainable global industrial agriculture, or to meet the sort of greed of extractive economies. But as accurate as this picture may be in some locations, it's not everywhere the case. And I think we need to often look more closely at what deforestation and forest degradation look like in practice in different locations in order to understand what a global effort to combat them might mean. Because if we don't, I think we could run the risk that such efforts might lead to more environmental injustice instead of climate change mitigation and justice. So my own research for the last few years has been on the social and political context of a particular kind of deforestation in East Africa, in particular in Uganda. I'm going to talk a bit more about my research a little later, but first I want to sketch out the connection between deforestation and climate change in the region where I work. Now, again, the dominant image of deforestation and climate change may come from the Amazon, but the relation between the two is also very important, but quite distinct in many parts of Africa. As one researcher said, Africa's emissions profile is remarkably different to that of other regions of the world. This is because Africa's fossil fuel emissions amount to only 4% of the global total, and almost all of that is the North African region and South Africa. Instead, it's land use change, agricultural and forestry emissions that account for the majority of sub-Saharan Africa's emissions. Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, in fact, is thought to be a net sink of CO2 due to low emissions and extensive forests in many parts of the continent. And Africa may comprise up to a third or more than a third of the global tropical forest carbon sink. Emissions from fossil fuel are indeed rising, but so are emissions from forest and land use change. Now we can see how these are connected when we look at Africa's energy profile. Sub-Saharan Africa's energy is dominated by woody biomass fuels, that is, by firewood and by charcoal. And there's little sign of a major energy transition happening to fossil fuels. Excluding South Africa, the primary energy demand for woody biomass is about 350 million tons of oil equivalent per year. Fossil fuels represent less than a third of that. In Uganda, it's estimated that almost 90% of primary energy consumption is woody biomass. So what is woody biomass? It's largely, again, firewood in rural areas, and over 90% of rural inhabitants rely almost entirely on firewood for cooking and heating, which represents almost their entire energy consumption. And in urban areas, anywhere from about half to up to 90% of urban inhabitants rely on charcoal made from wood for their energy. It's not only residential. Basic industry can also rely on wood and charcoal for heat, for processing raw materials, for institutional use. And so the use of charcoal is expanding at an estimated 3% per year. And indeed, even as other sources of residential energy become available, people are not seen to be switching fuels entirely, say from charcoal to liquid petroleum gas or LPG. Rather, people tend to practice what is called fuel stacking, using multiple forms of energy alongside each other. Moreover, Africa's ongoing rapid urbanization means that more and more people are coming to depend upon charcoal as their primary fuel. Now, of course, all this wood has to come from somewhere. So we can start to see how Africa's climate change contribution and emissions profile is indeed partly an energy question, although not a question of fossil fuels. Because the woody biomass needed for firewood and for charcoal, for providing energy for rural and urban African populations, and even for some industry, is coming from the continent's forests. So in other words, again, climate change contribution and emissions is an energy question, but not a question of fossil fuels as it is in much of the world. Rather, it's a question largely that involves the region's forests. And so in terms of charcoal, an estimated 30 million tons of charcoal are produced in Africa each year, comprising well over half of global production, to the extent that some studies have declared charcoal to be the main cause of forest degradation in sub-Saharan Africa today. So we can start to see how these all link up to form the big picture. The predominance of wood fuels in Africa means that a major part of its emissions and contribution to climate change is indeed from energy, not from fossil fuels, but from wood fuels. And not so much because of direct emissions, though of course there are emissions from inefficient charcoal production and consumption of wood fuels in terms of CO2 and other forms of air pollution, but primarily because of the loss of carbon sinks as forests are cut down or degraded. And the continued growth and demand and use of wood fuel, especially charcoal, means that this will most probably continue into the future. So to return to last week's Glasgow Declaration, it's about forests, yes, but in Africa, it's also about energy. It's about the energy central to the lives of the urban and the rural poor, as well as in the case of charcoal, it's about a massive industry employing tens of millions of people. So for me, because of the research that a team of international team of researchers and I have been doing, very different questions arise from last week's declaration. For us, the important questions are not only whether this lofty declaration to end deforestation will actually be implemented and be successful, but rather we also are asking, well, if it is implemented, what impact will these new policies, these interventions happening in the name of slowing climate change, what impact will these have on the lives of hundreds of millions of urban and rural people who rely on wood fuel, who rely on forests every day for cooking and heating? And also, what impact may it have on the tens of millions of rural inhabitants who rely on charcoal for some cash income, sometimes just to make it through hard times? And so my concern is that last week's statement may end up being used to, in some cases, support the effort by states or international agencies to try to stamp out charcoal production and use altogether. And this is a concern because efforts to ban charcoal production are long-standing parts of sort of the policy framework and energy policy in many places across the continent, and these policies have often had very harmful impacts. And this is the case because the dominant national and international policy framework concerning charcoal casts charcoal as a dirty fuel, as antithetical to achieving sustainable and modern energy, as a symptom of energy poverty, harmful to economic and social development, and especially as being highly ecologically destructive. And so charcoal's ubiquitous and growing use due to population increase and urbanization is decried as a looming, possibly imminent ecological disaster due to wood extraction outstripping regrowth. And just as one example of this, from a recent Ugandan newspaper, I think we can see the ways in which charcoal is framed in sort of in the media, which obviously reflects state policy. Uganda's forest cover is at its lowest due to the charcoal industry, so putting all blame on charcoal. Forests could be totally depleted by 2051. In Nakasongola, timeline of decline, so from 60 years ago when it was supplying charcoal to Kampala, to the degradation of the district, to now today, the district has become wasteland. So we can see the really kind of dramatic discourses around charcoal that exist. And again, that was just from I think an article last month in the Ugandan New Vision newspaper. So my question is whether this new declaration to end deforestation, which again, when one first reads about it with images one has of the Amazon or forests being cut down for plantations, whether this new declaration to end deforestation is going to feed into this existing dominant narrative of dirty, antiquated charcoal needing to be done away with, and thus leading to harsh policies enforced to strictly regulate or stop people from producing or using charcoal. And the problem is that the sort of track record of these policies has shown that these kinds of efforts to ban charcoal outright, to strictly regulate and control trade, have led to real problems for people dependent upon charcoal for income and for energy. Now, these kinds of questions are often missed from high-level discussions and decisions, but I think attention to them is crucial if efforts at climate change mitigation, if efforts to bring climate change and emissions under control, if efforts at climate justice are not going to unintentionally be at the expense of the people in the global south, are not going to unintentionally make life, in fact, worse for the populations who are supposed to benefit from these policies, make life worse for the people who are said to be most vulnerable to climate change. And so to better understand the social impact of climate change policies around deforestation, we need to better understand the role of charcoal in people's lives, urban and rural. We need to understand the place of wood fuels in histories of energy, in the economies of forests. And we need to understand the political interests that are served by the wood fuel economy. Which brings me to my own research. So I'm going to show some images here so people can have a bit more of a picture of what I'm talking about. Let's see. All right, that should do it. So my own research has been in northern Uganda. You can see the map here, the topmost, the shaded region. And my research has been, I've been conducting research there since the start of my PhD, which was now 20 years ago. My research was originally, well, as some of you might know, or probably do know, there was a war in this part of the country from 1986 until about 2006, 2007. And so a civil war between a rebel group called the Lord's Resistance Army and the Ugandan government. And so when I first began doing research in this region, it was in the context of armed conflict. I was looking especially at the internment camps, or internally displaced people's camps that the government had forced the population into. And I was interested in the politics of humanitarianism, of the impact that the provision of relief aid was having upon the conflict, whether this massive relief industry was helping or what its consequences were. So this led to my first book, Displacing Human Rights, in which I argued that international involvement was actually making the situation worse, not better, largely because these forms of international intervention were supporting the Ugandan government's counterinsurgency, which was based upon reductive narratives of a good Ugandan government versus bad rebels. So when the war ended, I continued to look at this particular nexus between local and national politics and international intervention. And so as the war ended in 2006, 2007, and people started to go back home from the camps where they had been for sometimes up to 10 years, the political questions became focused around things like reintegrating former soldiers, providing justice for victims, redistributing land, reestablishing social and political order in the ravaged region. And international intervention came to be oriented around narratives of post-conflict justice, of peace building, of recovery and development, of international criminal justice. But then a few years ago, things shifted again. Locally and nationally, there was a shift to environmental issues, especially the destruction of forests. And people were blaming the destruction of forests on charcoal production and illegal logging. There was also a lot of talk of droughts, of changed rainfall patterns. But it was also at this time that climate change adaptation and mitigation started to dominate international interventions in many parts of the continent. So this is a new context that arose. One focused around environmental issues in the context of climate change, in the context in northern Uganda, focused especially on deforestation, but still within a context of thinking about local politics, national politics on the one side, and forms of international intervention, now international intervention around sustainable development or climate change mitigation or adaptation on the other. And my question is still, as I think was reflected in my the questions I raised about the Glasgow Declaration, my question is really still, are these forms of international intervention making things better, or are they making things worse? Are they helping resolve the problems they claim to be addressing, or in some cases, may they in fact be exacerbating those problems or creating new problems? So this leads to my current research, which you can see here, fueling violence to fueling peace, charcoal and environmental justice in Uganda. This is the project we're working on right now. You can see some of the people from the team. There's also people in South Sudan working on it, funded by the British Academy. But this project that we're doing right now, that we've been doing some field work this year, and we'll be doing quite a bit next year, also builds on several other projects that I've been doing for about 4 years now. The first one was a research project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council about 4 years ago. And then that set the foundation for some series of project and work that I was doing that was very generously funded by the Philomathia Foundation, the relationship that I've built through Trinity Hall, where, as Shel mentioned, I'm the Philomathia Fellow. So been doing a lot of work with the Philomathia Foundation, which is very interested in questions of energy, of sustainable development, of justice in these regions. And this all kind of set the foundation for this very significant project that we're doing now, that we'll be doing probably for the next year and a half, as things have been set back a bit due to the pandemic. So just a little bit of background, what is charcoal? Well, charcoal begins in places like this. All these photos are mine from northern Uganda. Sticks, logs are collected from the countryside, and then they are put into pretty basic earth mound kilns. So here you can see on the left, it's a, I hope things are oriented the same way, but the smoke is coming out of an ongoing kiln that's sitting there. The wood is carbonizing for up to about a week. On the right, you can see a dismantled kiln. So you can see the sort of scraps of charcoal sitting around there. So these are sort of basic earth mound kilns to make a couple sacks of charcoal. Here's another basic earth mound kiln where people are making charcoal. And this is on a very small scale, so you don't need very much labor at all to do this kind of thing. People will make a few sacks of charcoal like this. These are slightly larger kilns, but basically those are sort of two sacks sewn together, charcoal, that are then often taken by bicycle or by motorbike to roadsides, and they're collected like this, where trucks passing by or individual consumers passing by will buy a sack or two of charcoal, because the prices, if you're driving to the capital, Kampala in the south, the prices for charcoal are much lower if you buy them here along the roadside rather than buying your charcoal in the capital itself. So this is just a shot of the road heading south to Kampala from Gulu, from the northern region. You can see how in certain areas there's a lot of charcoal stacked up, ready to be sold. So once it arrives in Kampala, it's often sold in sort of market areas. It's sort of a sprawling network of retailers. Here it's a bit hard to tell, but you can see there's charcoal being sold from the sort of second building, the second door from the right, with a woman standing with her hand on her hip. You can see the bag of charcoal sort of on the ground there, where people can buy different amounts, from an entire sack to a basin to even just sort of a coffee tin like that of charcoal. So you can buy charcoal you need for a month, or charcoal you need just to make one meal. There's another shot of sort of a charcoal, larger charcoal selling place on the street in Kampala. And then people bring it home and use it in small stoves that are sometimes sort of improved stoves. Sometimes you can just build stoves yourself again, or buy them in the market very cheaply. People use charcoal in those. And for consumers, charcoal is attractive because of its lightweight, because of its high heat content. It burns more cleanly relative to firewood. And again, the low cost of purchasing and maintaining charcoal cook stoves versus LPG or kerosene, or let alone electricity, make it highly accessible. But what happens between the tree and the stove varies considerably. So what I've traced out here is sort of one kind of commodity chain. But very small producers bring things to the roadside themselves, sell it maybe a sack or two at a time, and then that is distributed in different ways to consumers. Now, that is certainly one way in which charcoal is produced and marketed, but I think there's a dominant assumption in the policy literature that that is the only way that charcoal is produced and marketed. There's a dominant assumption that It's always produced by the rural poor. The United Nations Development Programs wrote that charcoal is produced by, quote, unorganized groups or individuals, often the poorest of the poor, just trying to make a bit of cash income. And so it's assumed that this unregulated sector of small producers are the people driving deforestation and ecological degradation. As people are ignorantly or desperately cutting down trees that they actually need to survive. And of course, there's a long history of blaming the African rural poor for harm to their environments. And these images have underpinned waves of colonial or post-colonial interventions into people's lives in the name of stopping people from unsustainably exploiting their own environments. And so if this is the model that policymakers have in mind of charcoal production, then ending charcoal-driven deforestation would mean intervening into the lives of these rural populations to regulate and control charcoal production and trade, to get people to stop producing charcoal unsustainably, perhaps stop them from producing it altogether. Now, this is the dominant picture of the industry. But what our research has revealed is that, in fact, that is not the only way that charcoal is produced and marketed. And in fact, these small household producers using very basic earth mound kilns, again, to remind you of the sort of size that we're looking at here, it's pretty small earth mound kilns, a couple sacks at a time. In fact, this kind of production is increasingly being overshadowed by this kind of production. So you can see this is a massive kiln, the same basic principle of stacking up the wood, covering it with some, well, here's sort of kindling things to get the fire going, then burying this entire thing will be buried in mud, and then it will be lit and slowly left for the wood to carbonize over a week or two. So it's the same principle, but the scale is vastly different. And so there is, in fact, what we call semi-industrial form of charcoal production that has taken precedence and has really expanded throughout northern Uganda and many other regions, precisely because the possibility of really significant profits have assembled powerful political and economic interests around this kind of production. And so this comprises large operators, usually from the south of the country, bringing in contracted work teams. So dozens or even hundreds of workers at a time brought in, set up in basic work camps, and then basically clear cutting entire swaths of forest. As you can see here, using chainsaws in order to cut down trees instead of using machetes or hand axes. And so entire kilometers of trees can be cleared in a short period of time and turned into charcoal. And so large trucks plying the countryside have become kind of a ubiquitous part of the scene. They are also often accompanied by timber extraction. Here you can see, I think it's a Azalea africana tree that has been cut down for very valuable hardwoods. So this kind of timber extraction often accompanies charcoal production as well. And you can see here's kind of the impact of what the countryside can look like after charcoal has been produced. You can see the stumps with chainsaw having been cut down by chainsaws. And sometimes the work crews will in fact uproot the very roots of the trees and burn those so nothing can grow back where they were. Other scenes of kind of what's left. And so this charcoal is produced in the various locations of the countryside, then brought to packing centers like this one. This is just along a road going out from Gulu town someplace, repacked in significant operations like this. And then sometimes repacked. This is in one of the little well, not so little anymore, but one of the trading centers in Uganda where the repacking can occur. And so these large trucks have become kind of a ubiquitous aspect, as I said, of the countryside. Here you can see this is now the road to Kampala from the north. So whole fleets of trucks making their way south, basically carrying out the region's forests. So, as you might imagine, this kind of industrial, semi-industrial production is widely decried by the rural community who are watching as entire forests are being cut down, leaving just cratered landscapes. Community members in our research denounced the kind of ecological devastation they saw as being caused by this mass extraction of trees. And the most widespread grievance was that tree cutting, not only the loss of the trees themselves, but was leading to decreased rainfall and higher temperatures, and thus significantly affecting crop yields. And beyond changing rainfall, the commons that all depended upon for firewood, medicinal plants, grazing lands, and building materials were being destroyed. And as many trees have kind of historical resonance, oftentimes the very foundation for communal solidarity was being lost as these trees were being lost and the forests that had historical importance were being lost. But the fact that there were two very different production and trade systems, on the one side, small scale artisanal household production, and on the other, large scale semi-industrial, this tends to be ignored in charcoal policy. Instead, as I mentioned, the exclusive focus is on the rural poor as themselves driving unsustainable charcoal production, when in fact, all evidence points to the fact that large-scale production, semi-industrial production and trade with hired work crews, with chainsaws, clear-cutting forests, they are the ones who are causing the ecological damage. And there's very little evidence, if any, that small rural producers, that artisanal production is really having any significant ecological, negative ecological impact. And so this is the problem, is that when policies to stop deforestation are put into place, if they ignore large-scale production and they focus on small producers, these policies that are put into place can end up being counterproductive, ineffective, or even harmful. The problem, of course, is that it's very politically convenient to ignore this large-scale production and to place the blame for deforestation on small rural producers. First of all, because those doing large-scale production are often politically connected, or sometimes it's the state itself that's carrying this out. In Uganda, as I mentioned, large-scale charcoal industry is dominated by a handful of Kampala-based elites who own fleets of trucks, who buy entire sections of forests, bring in their workers, and the Ugandan state and military can be involved, either as partners, as hired protection, or as the owners of the business. Local government may be in on it too, and a lot of communities we spoke to reported that local administrations were reaping profits from collaborating with charcoal dealers and thus had no interest in ending the trade, however destructive. So the result has been that the powerful can cut down trees for charcoal and timber with impunity, while blame for deforestation is placed on small household producers. Now, there's another reason why it's politically convenient to ignore large-scale, ecologically destructive charcoal production and trade. That is because blaming the rural poor gives the state and international organizations a justification for intervening into their lives. It gives the state and international bodies an excuse to, in the name of regulating and controlling charcoal production and trade, in the name of stopping illegal production, it gives a justification for significant forms of intervention into rural lives and livelihoods. And so these state efforts to regulate, control, or sometimes even criminalize charcoal production can represent the extension of often violent state power into forests and rural communities in the name of preventing deforestation. So the imposition of strict laws in the name of ending deforestation can drive small producers into illegality as they lack the resources needed to obtain permits, to draw up forest management plans, or to access improved kilns. In Malawi, for instance, where all production is today formally illegal, an entire industry are rendered what one researcher called criminals by necessity, and thus rendering the rural poor vulnerable to the arbitrary power of police and state officials. And so this kind of intensified regulation can mean that those who have the economic or political clout needed to abide by complex regulations or even avoid enforcement can benefit and can squeeze out those without access to resources or power. When the state controls the sector, local government may seek to unsustainably maximize production to raise revenues, and increased regulation, thus paradoxically, can end up giving more power to those who are already advantaged and further discriminate against those who are already disadvantaged. This can have, for instance, gendered impacts, where women might be the most small scale and vulnerable producers of charcoal. Criminalization ends up impacting most significantly and most harmfully on them. And of course, the state can use these expanded surveillance and security regimes established in the name of ending illegal charcoal production to impose authority over independent or recalcitrant rural populations, to grab land, or to secure access to mineral resources. And again, there's a long history of such practices throughout the region. History of the displacement of rural populations for national parks and nature conservation. History of militarized conservation, turning local people into targets for violence in the name of preserving wilderness or animals. History of local people being displaced for large pine or eucalyptus plantations in the name, say, of carbon offsets. And so imposing political regulation or control over charcoal, whether to ban it altogether or try to make it more sustainable, does not guarantee either greater sustainability or equity. Rather, depending on the social and political context, the imposition of regulations can represent the intensification of unaccountable power over rural communities, or the extension of ecologically damaging and impoverishing production forms, while ignoring the real culprits of deforestation. So this is kind of the final lesson that you can draw from this, is that before celebrating and putting into place massive new policies to end deforestation, we need to know more about the social and political structures of which that deforestation is a part. In the case of charcoal, different modes of production need to be distinguished so as not to blame the destruction of large-scale producers on small-scale producers. And overall, we need to, I think, better understand the possible impacts of anti-deforestation policies that will affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people in the global south before those policies are implemented. Now, this is difficult, of course, because these policies are being made in the name of a climate emergency. They're being made based upon the idea that we have basically no time left. We need to act now. But in some cases like this one, we might actually need more information. We might need to think more before we act about the contribution that the poor of the global south are actually having on climate change, and thus what impact some of these climate change mitigation policies will have, policies that are being billed as for the very benefit of these populations. Now, this isn't a particularly easy argument to make, because clearly we all know how corporations and states have manipulated information, have claimed that we don't yet know enough, have exaggerated uncertainty, so as to deny the reality of environmental harm, from that caused by tobacco to pollution to climate change. And we know that action does indeed need to be taken urgently around climate change. But again, when it's the emissions of the poor, we need to be very, very careful. And when the poor are being targeted through possibly massive forceful interventions into their lives, livelihoods, there needs to be real precaution practiced, which again, I think signals the place for continued research, not just on the science of climate change, but on the politics and impacts of climate change policy. So that's where I hope that kind of research projects that we've been undertaking, that we're continuing to do, can help play some productive role in thinking through some of these problems. So I will leave it at that, and I will welcome questions and conversation from here. So again, many thanks to Shell for setting this up and enabling me to be part of this really exciting seminar series. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was so interesting and really insightful as to what's been going on in northern Uganda. And I know you said as well, your research has been interrupted by the pandemic, as I know it has for many people. I think we've got a question that's come through. A question: what would a better managed charcoal industry look like?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Well, I guess the last I worked for Food for the Hungry and just completed a nutrition development project in eastern Uganda. So it sounds like you have a very clear picture of what what kind of the place of charcoal is in rural economies. So what's interesting is that there's a new sort of effort towards what we might call sustainable charcoal or green charcoal today. It's involving, the way that I think about it is that it's involving formalization. So it's involving imposing legal regulations. It's recognizing that most charcoal production today takes place outside of legal regulation. So it's a matter of putting laws into place, putting into place regulation, ensuring that there's some sort of overall management and oversight of the charcoal industry. And that, along with sort of more technical issues around sort of improved kilns for making charcoal, improved stoves so as to improve efficiency, better trading networks. So I think there's sort of the policy framework has these two sides. One of like a technological dimension around kilns and stoves, the other formalizing the law and the regulatory framework. Now, both of those I think have a very important place in bringing about a better managed charcoal industry. But for me, the problem is that, as with the policy that I've been talking about, this anti-deforestation policy, we need to think about what the political and social consequences of these new technologies and these new regulations might be, because they might not necessarily lead to the kinds of positive consequences that we're looking for. So as an example, improved technology. So there's an idea that a big problem with charcoal is that it's being produced inefficiently. You saw the earth mound kilns. So if instead other kinds of kilns were used, metal kilns, or there were improvements on those earth mound kilns, and the efficiency of production went from, I think it's about 10% now up to maybe 30%, great. You would only have to use 1/3 as much of the forest in order to produce the same amount of charcoal. Now, of course, unfortunately, that's often not the way it works. With more efficient production, it doesn't lead to less production, but rather it leads to even more production. As the people producing it go out and try to find new markets, you start to see charcoal being traded not just locally, but nationally or internationally. So in a sense, putting into place these kind of technological fixes without thinking about the broader social political context can sometimes be counterproductive. And in the same way, some of these new regulations, especially criminal regulations, can lead to in the same direction. So something that's often proposed is permits for charcoal production. Now, the problem, I think I briefly referred to this in my talk, but the problem is that it's sometimes very difficult to access those permits. You need to have some kind of forestry management plan. You might need to read or write. You might have to have enough money to pay the local government. You might need to be able to get to the seat of local government in order to get the permit. So there's a whole range of sort of costs that go into being legal and engaging in legal production. Now, the problem is that the people, those who are going to have the ability to engage in that legal production, have the resources to conform to the law, are usually precisely those who already have power and already have resources, and thus those who are poor or more vulnerable or marginalized already are the ones who are not going to be able to access that new the permitting or forest management or other new regulations. So what ends up happening is that putting these new regulations in place, whilst the people who have the resources to become legal and formalized, it then marginalizes and often criminalizes those who don't have the resources to abide by these regulations. But that doesn't mean they stop producing charcoal. It means they continue to produce it, but now are even more vulnerable and are making even less money because they might have to bribe people along the way in order to sell the charcoal. So I guess the overall answer to your question, Martin, is my view is that yes, there are dimensions of legal regulation, there are dimensions of technological innovation that need to play a role in terms of sort of slowly transforming the charcoal industry, but how these are put into place and what their implications are we need to pay attention to that. And we need to think about the social and political context that these are being implemented in, because again, there's significant possibilities for these policies to have counterproductive consequences in some cases.
And thank you. And you kind of touched on it there, but I was going to ask, you've obviously been going to Uganda now for a number of years, and I was just wondering if you'd noticed a change in attitude from the population in terms of increased concern about the forest vanishing, I think it was by 2051. And is there appetite to think about sustainable options, or has it just increased the divide between the semi-industrial production and the smaller scale artisanal? I mean, is it harder now to bring the community together to find a solution?
No, actually, I think it's the first. There has been, as you suggested, there has been a really significant sort of upsurge in sort of environmental activism, debates around the environment. So in northern Uganda, there's a number of youth groups that have come up that are working around the environment. There's a group called Our Trees, We Need Answers. They're demanding exactly that, answers as to where are all these trees going, that have been doing great work, great activist work around these issues. And then just, the constant presence of these debates and questions in newspapers, on the radio, in development intervention. So there has been a really increased attention to deforestation, to environmental issues. And when people are thinking about that, it's so obvious, from that perspective, it's so obvious where the problem lies, which is big dealers coming in from outside with work crews and cutting everything down. There's been a lot of pushback against them. So communities have been banning external producers from coming in. Communities have been putting certain trees off limits, castigating members of the community who sell their trees. So there's a lot of dynamism around that right now. Which has been really interesting, and also on the national level. I mean, the article I started with was from the government official newspapers. So there's attention on that level as well. Again, the hope is that it doesn't just become sort of, technological solutions will solve everything, but rather really attention to the social and political problems that are part of it.
Great, no, thank you. We've had a couple more questions come in. If anyone does want to type a question in, please go ahead. So we've got Richard asking about reforestation. So is reforestation part of the policy mix in Uganda so that wood could be sourced sustainably, and what can be done to encourage this? Right,
thanks, Richard. There is some, mostly, and so again, there's a debate there. Maybe about 10 years ago or so, there were a couple large plantations that were pine plantations that were set up through sort of public-private collaborations with donor involvement, but especially with private companies doing carbon offsets. So, when you tick the offset my flight box. This company plants a few trees in Uganda or something like that, right? But there were a few issues like that that were involved a lot of displacement of community. So in other words, it was the sort of the worst side of this kind of carbon forestry, whereby communities that were living in an area are displaced, the forest is cleared or the bush is cleared, and then pine or eucalyptus plantations are put into place. So there was a lot of negative, well, I mean, rightfully so, a lot of negative publicity around those. So there's been a rollback, and there hasn't been much in terms of sort of plantation forestry, but there is a lot of new interest in agroforestry. So using trees, whether individually or small woodlots on, amidst farms or on institutional land or in different places. So there is some work around reforestation and afforestation, both. But I think it's well, two things. One, there hasn't been as significant of a movement as there has been, say, in Kenya, with Wangari Maathai and the Green movement, the Green Belt movement and things there. So there hasn't been as big a sort of national movement around tree planting. But also I think that in the places where charcoal and industrial agriculture are really expanding, it's just expanding so fast. And the forests are disappearing so fast that any kind of reforestation program is lagging way behind. So again, where the activism comes, people are aware of tree planting, but people see it as sort of too little, too late in some cases, and needing much more of a sort of state involvement instead of the state causing the problems, helping to solve them.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question for Mary, asking you to say a bit more about your research team and obviously working with a very international group, and what's that's been like working with researchers across countries, and I imagine challenging during the pandemic.
Yeah, so this has been one of the most, absolutely exciting aspects of the work, and something that's really encouraged, fortunately, these days by funding organizations like the British Academy, and the La Mafia Foundation has from the beginning been very enthusiastic about working with researchers and students in the places where we do our work in East Africa. So yeah, it's been really interesting, not only because the researchers are from, well, I think you saw on the list, 5 or 6 different countries, but also because they're from 5 or 6 different disciplines. So we have, first off, natural scientists and social scientists working together, and it's a bit like cats and dogs, one thinks, but actually we get along great. And it's been working really, really well. And I mean, maybe, we just got lucky that the natural scientists we're working with are very sympathetic to social scientists, or maybe they think they're lucky to find social scientists who are interested in natural science. So that's been really interesting as well. Our Kenya researchers are bioenergy scientists. So that's been really interesting. Yeah, COVID obviously has made it really difficult. We had a whole program laid out for big, inception meetings and strategizing. And so it's led to much, I mean, the research has still gone on, but it's just much less, more disaggregated. Here, teams doing things when they can. Our South Sudan team did their research when they could, and, put it in. The Uganda researchers doing research when possible, just because of shifting lockdowns and everything. So, yeah, so it's definitely exciting. The challenges were both intellectual, but also, with COVID, very, very logistical as well. But again, this is what everybody's dealing with right now. So we're all coming up with ways to deal with it and to work in the midst of this. So, yeah, thanks, Mary.
Brilliant, no, thank you. It's definitely the power of interdisciplinarity, isn't it, to find solutions to these global problems. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. And is the plan, is it another kind of year or so for this research, and then almost to get the kind of paper that will provide additional information to maybe the next COP, so that any kind of statements there, there'll be additional information
absolutely. Yeah, so we're doing a number of different things. So we have a piece right now on sort of rethinking sustainable charcoal that's sort of going to be an agenda that has 12 of us all writing on it together. That's sort of an agenda setting piece for, as I was just saying, why we need to think about charcoal in its context and try to make that case. Because most people work on charcoal are either rural development or natural scientists. So to make the case to them why we need to take social and political context into account. That's one thing we're working on. Another thing we're working on is that I'm working with a guy in Ghana at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology is simply the question of how do we know what we think we know about charcoal? Because when you start digging into charcoal statistics, the divergences are huge. And I mean, you can imagine why, right? I mean, much of the industry is gray area or illegal, right? So how does one figure these things out? Charcoal is being exported, some charcoal is sold, you get on your bike, you ride it over to town for an hour and you sell it there. Other charcoal is sold in the capital. Other charcoal is sent, Ugandan charcoal going to Kenya, South Sudanese charcoal coming to Uganda, being relabeled as Ugandan, then sent to Kenya, and then being sent to the Gulf or to Europe. And when it comes to Europe, it's often relabeled again. So how one, and then so much of the industry is so hard to get a grip on that the sort of statistics out there are all over the place. Now, the thing is that these statistics are then feeding into climate models. They're feeding into the kind of, the very sort of physical science basis of climate change work that's going on by the IPCC. So we're really interested in where do these facts come from? What are the origin of these facts? We often find something, a statistic. Actually, it's funny. The slide I started with, that Ugandan article, the statistics in that started in a 2013 report by the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. Nobody ever traces these back, but they were in that Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development report, 2013. And when the ministry put that report out, it said, this is very speculative. We're just kind of, there's a lot of uncertainty. No one really knows. Here's kind of a vague estimation, maybe. Those were taken out of that report, turned into established fact, and then started circulating through reports, through media stories, everywhere. I mean, I cited them in an peer-reviewed article of mine, just thinking they were fact, right? And now I'm like, oh no, what? I'm adding to the problem. I'm contributing to it. So these facts end up, then in newspapers, right? So we really want to ask, how do we know what we think we know about charcoal? And how does that uncertainty around charcoal, how might it lead us to rethink, or not rethink, but help think a bit differently or contribute to overall thinking about climate change or large patterns of deforestation in the continent?
Yeah, because I was going to say it must be so difficult to actually get the data that you need to say, actually this intervention might be doing more harm than good.
Oh,
but
yeah.
to know the evidence and be able to measure it must be
almost
so
impossible. Because when a regulation is put in place, or even it's like sort of the uncertainty principle, like if you put if you set up a researcher to figure out how much charcoal is coming into the capital, people driving the trucks will see that researcher there. They'll figure he's police and then start taking a different route, right? So just by observing the industry, it's changing it. So it's really, really difficult, to know.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you so much. I think we're at the hour and no more further questions will come in, but thank you for such an interesting presentation and discussion. Thank you to all of our speakers in the climate change series, and I'd like to thank everyone in the alumni and development team at Trinity Hall for all their help in putting these events together. Thank you to you at home for watching and supporting them. Obviously, all our future events, both online and in person, are on our website. But a final thank you to you, Adam. Again, great presentation, and thank you to everyone at home for watching. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.